today I broke into school so that I could have the big whiteboard and all of my expo markers. You know that I love them. But it looked like from the work that you guys did last Thursday that there were a bunch of questions about pollination and all the new vocabulary that goes with that. So I wanted to make sure that we understand that before we move on to photosynthesis. That has a whole nother set of vocabulary. So let's focus today on just pollination. And remember, there are two parts that are required for pollination, and not every flower has both parts. So there's the male stamen, that's the whole male structure, and there's the female pistil, the whole female structure. Some flowers are considered perfect and they have both combined, which is great. It means it's very easy for them to be pollinated, and some flowers, like for blueberries or zucchini, they have only flowers that have just several male structures, and they have other flowers that have just one pistil, one female structure. So the first bit of vocabulary is that the stamen is the entire male structure. It has the word men in it, stamen, okay? So that is all the male structure. And pistil, the lady is a pistil, is the entire female structure. So let's focus on the male structure first, okay? The stamen consists of really three parts. There's a top part that is usually brown, and that is called the anther. The anther's job is to make pollen. That's its only job. It exists just to make pollen. And pollen are these little orange dots here. Sorry, I get nervous when I record myself. All right, pollen are these little orange dots. Each anther produces hundreds and thousands of pollen cells. So it is trying as hard as it can, because not every pollen cell is going to find its way to the stigma. So it produces many, 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 because it knows that some of these pollen cells are going to wind up on your car and on anything that you leave outside carried away by the wind. So all of these orange cells are pollen cells, and those are the male reproductive cell of a flower. So its only job is for reproduction. This has nothing to do with food, nothing to do with storage or transport. Pollination is only about making tiny baby flowers, okay? So the anther holds and makes all of the pollen. Now, if this was down by the roots of the plant, or if it was down at the very inside of the flower, it wouldn't be very effective, because those pollen cells wouldn't have a chance to go anywhere. So in order for it to be held up so that wind that passes by can knock some of that pollen out, there's a filament. A filament holds the anther up really, really high, and that helps because then it forces anything that comes by, like a bee or a butterfly, to brush up against the anther and collect some of the pollen on it. So the filament doesn't really have much of a job, except that it holds that anther up really high. Stamen is the whole structure. Anther is the top part that makes pollen. Pollen is the male reproductive cell. And filament holds the whole thing up really high in the hopes that, that the pollen gets lifted off and carried somewhere else. Male structure. Okay, so the female structure over here. The whole structure is called a pistil. Okay, I didn't make the rules. The whole structure is called a pistil, and the pistil has a couple of different parts, and each of them are really important. There's the stigma, that's the very top. It's the opening, and it also is covered with that really sweet nectar. And that smell of the nectar and the bright colors of the petals are what attracts a lot of pollinators. So they smell this nectar and they fly into the flower, and any pollen that they have covered themselves with is then deposited on the sticky stigma. The stigma is the sticky nectar covered opening of this pistil, okay? Once the pollen goes on the stigma, it is transported down this really hollow tube, which is called the style. The lady has style, okay? So the sticky stigma is just there to get the pollen. Then the pollen travels down this style, which is a hollow tube, and it goes into this large base, which is called the ovary, okay? The ovary houses these tiny female cells called ovules. And once the ovules and the pollen combine, the ovary is going to form a fruit. So every time you bite into an apple, you're actually biting into the ovary of a fertilized apple. Okay, so the ovary just is responsible for making and housing these ovules. And just like the anther produces a ton of pollen, the ovary has a lot of ovules, okay? These ovules are in little pockets down here in the ovary. And the ovules are the female cell. They combine with the male cell, and once the two combine, it forms a seed. So these tiny little ovules become seeds. The ovary becomes the flower. And what happens is you have a little bee, okay? You've got a little bee. It's got its wings and its stripes. Miles, I know that you're secretly dying right now, okay? Your bee flies past, and he wants to get to the stigma because he smells the really sweet nectar, and so he brushes up against this anther. Okay, and now, because of all the little fur on your bee, he's covered with all of these pollen cells. And the pollen cells, when the bee finally lands on the stigma, that pollen that was produced by the anther and held up by the filament, that pollen gets deposited here in the sticky stigma, and it goes down the style into the ovary and combines with the ovule. And once the pollen and the ovule combine, this now becomes a seed. The ovary starts transforming itself into a fruit. The fruit is there for a couple of reasons. One, it does provide some nutrients to the seed as the seed germinates. But mainly, the fruit is there to entice other things to come along and eat it, or carry the fruit to a separate place. And because the fruit then is going to drop the seeds and form a new plant in a second location, the baby plant and the parent plant where it was formed are in two different locations, which means they're not competing for water or nutrients or sunlight or anything else. So it's in the plant's best interest, once it forms a seed, to entice someone to take that seed away from the original plant. And that is what that fruit and ovary is there for, really. So that is pollination, okay? It depends on both the male and the female. It depends on some pollinators usually. Now it could be that just wind comes by, and wind takes the pollen from one anther and deposits it on the stigma, and that happens a lot too. You can actually go out, if you have a garden, and you can self-pollinate. You can take a paintbrush and you can brush the anther and get some of the pollen cells on it, and then you can find a female flower and brush the pollen cells off onto the stigma. You can form your own fruit and vegetables that way. It's really cool. So this is pollination, and I just wanted to review it for you today. That's it.